Thank you very much, all three of you, for the answer to that very important question. We're going to move on now to talk about the pathway and the identification process. And so this is a question for Debbie and Dawn. Who is actually responsible for identifying dyslexia in my child's school, and what should I be asking the school as a parent?
Thanks, Kathy. In the first instance, the responsibility for identifying dyslexia doesn't sit with one particular person. It's that team around the child. So the class teacher might be your first point of contact when you're speaking to them about concerns, and they would absolutely be very involved, but it doesn't just sit with them, it sits with the group of people. So it may be looking towards the authority. What access do you have to specialist knowledge, whether it be through representatives within the school or centrally, and looking at gathering all that assessment information, and that team around the child collectively looking at that to see if it's relevant for an identification, and if not, what other supports would go in as necessary. I think, sorry, just to follow on from that, the key thing within that, although it doesn't sit with one person, is having that key point of contact of communication, so that when that process is ongoing, that parents are involved within it and know how that process is progressing, know what's happening at the different stages. As Dawn touched upon, it can be that collaborative approach, and that contextual approach can take time, which can feel quite frustrating waiting on that answer, but it doesn't mean there's lots of assessment not going on. It's part of a process, and I think it's really important to have that open line of communication to say, this is what's happening next, this is why we're taking this time, so we can get that really full rounded holistic picture with everybody feeding into it, so we're getting that balanced profile of strengths and needs and the appropriate identification and supports at the end of that.
I think my advice to parents would be to put things in writing, because when you're having conversations at parents' night and things get lost, and information doesn't always necessarily follow through. So even after you had a meeting with the teacher and it's been discussed, following up with an email saying, as we discussed at parents' night, I would like my child to be assessed, have a contextual assessment, and just laying out your concerns and why you think that those are concerns, and keeping that sort of communication going with the schools as well. I often say to parents, if there shouldn't be any changes when they have eventually identified as dyslexia, because as you said, as you're going along the pathway, you find things that they find challenging, and you automatically put in supports for them. Well, we'll do this, or we'll try that. So really, by the time you come to the conclusion, if you do that they have got dyslexia, everything else has already fallen into place for them. So it's quite important. And it's really the support that's more important. Although I do agree with Fran that it is important we use the term dyslexia.
I think just to follow on from that advice of putting it in writing is really, really useful, Dawn. I think if the local authority get a request for a dyslexia assessment in writing, there's a legal status that comes in that the assessment process has to start within 6 weeks, and there needs to be some form of feedback within 10. It doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome will be found within that 10 weeks, but you've got that line of communication. But actually, more importantly, what you touched on, Dawn, there was given that information within that request. So saying, following on from the conversation we had, I want this assessment to take place, but here's why we want to be investigating dyslexia and having that assessment done, because that information is invaluable as part of the assessment process. And if you know why people are starting to have that wondering round about dyslexia, it gives you that steer on where to dig that bit deeper, and also that knowledge from home of how you know your child, and that information can be really key to then taking that and looking at it in the educational context and getting that balance of looking at it from both sides.
Thank you very much. A question now that I'm going to ask maybe Fran to answer first, and maybe Dawn as well. What kind of assessment arrangements can I expect from my child?
This is really, really important for everybody to be aware that children and young people where there is evidence that they require assessment arrangements are entitled to them. Again, it's not about having a formal label in order to access these assessment arrangements. And people are probably more familiar with assessment arrangements through the SQA in a secondary setting, but actually, be aware that in a primary setting, assessment arrangements should also be there when they're needed. And an example of that would be the Scottish National Standardised Assessments, which are usually referred to as the SNASs. So they're sat in P1, P3, P7 and S3. And, when these were first introduced, there were lots of questions about assessment arrangements, and the guidance that was given at the time and is still given is that if a child needs some extra time, if they need to have, these are done on the computer, if they need to access text recognition software, it should be there for them. Although I would say in those particular assessments, there is embedded some software in it. So it's just important that people realise that when we talk about assessment arrangements, it's not just for the exam or the test or the assessment. It's really meant to replicate the coursework throughout the year. And there are different types of assessment arrangements that are in place. Obviously, the younger the child is, they may not be as comfortable, for example, using text recognition software. However, I wouldn't underestimate young children. They are very adept to using IT and are normally far more adept than we are as adults. And I have seen, P1s and P2s being very proficient at using a range of supported assisted technology. It isn't all about IT. That the extra time's got nothing to do with IT. Some learners are absolutely entitled to a prompt, to have a reader and a scribe. I would add caution. Very often, if your first port of call is having a reader, somebody read it out to them, or to have a scribe, we are actually, particularly with the scribe, we are adding some additional layers, cognitive layers to the activity. What we want to do is get to the stage where that learner becomes as independent as possible, because that's the support they're going to have when they leave school predominantly. You can get readers and scribes in further and higher education, but more likely it will be software. And Dawn's going to share some information on secondary.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits that we have seen from the lockdown, from children doing online learning. Their skills, particularly with Glow, I think Debbie touched on before, using the immersive reader, using the dictate in Word through Glow, the children have become really proficient with that kind of thing. We have very few readers and scribes now. A couple of cases. I think I've got about 3 or 4 in my school for our exams, so that's one of my responsibilities. We have a lot of youngsters that are using IT and using the text to speech facilities in our school, and it's also that I haven't got enough computers for some of the exams, but then don't worry about that. And as I keep saying to staff, it has to be their normal classroom practice, which requires staff to be providing digital papers and using Glow. And a lot of our teachers are doing that, as well as using Glow as a way of sharing documents with young people. And it just makes it very inclusive. So if they want to go home and they want to use a text reader to read that for revision, they can. If they don't want to, they don't need to, then they've got it in a written format. So it's very inclusive. And I think, I hope that gone are the days where we used to do assessments with and without assessment arrangements. Young people should never have to sit an assessment without extra time if that's what's in their profile, and that's been evidence that they require that. So yeah, we're in the throes of doing that now in the run up to our May exams.
And I think it's worth highlighting, in case families aren't aware, that every pupil in Scotland has a Glow password, a Glow login. Some authorities are not using Glow because that's their choice, but every learner still has a Glow login and a Glow password, and they can ask for that, because incorporated in that is free access to Microsoft 365. So as a family, you don't need to buy it. You can just download it, and you can, I think you can get up to 5 licenses through Glow, which means that actually there's a real equitable provision for all of the Microsoft tools.
Yeah, we have youngsters that download it onto their phones as well, so they can actually edit. If you've got very good eyesight, you can edit documents and things on your phone, which the youngsters find very helpful. So,
thank you, Dawn and Fran. The next question is asked a lot. I'd be interested to hear Fran and Debbie's responses to this. I wonder if schools just don't have the resources to support children once they're identified.
And I can understand why families ask this question, but I think it's important to realise that, well, ask the question, what do we mean by resources in the first instance, and that we really are promoting, and there is really good practice across Scotland. It isn't the case to be able to say, that learners' needs are not being met across Scotland. Inclusive practice really does support a wide range, all of our learners' needs, and they are based on the approaches used in dyslexia for dyslexia-friendly approaches. We would call it, inclusive pedagogy. And so that really does suit our dyslexic learners. And the vast majority of these approaches don't cost any money. They are about ethos. They are about good learning, effective teaching, making sure that the learning and teaching is accessible, multisensory. What Dawn was talking about, for example, using the Microsoft tools, that the learners can engage directly using the appropriate tools. It's not about having a pupil support assistant or an ASN assistant sort of attached to the learner. And actually that is the last thing that a young person, or particularly in secondary school, want. They want to become independent, and there are other ways in which we can support them to do that. So it's not about resources suddenly opening and becoming available like a magic cupboard once you have that identification of dyslexia being made. It hasn't been the case since 2004 in Scotland, because we're needs-led.
I think as well, with dyslexia being it's a lifelong condition, so you want to build those skills and build that confidence in how our learners that are dyslexic and are identified at school can have that toolbox of things that they can tap into that they will need lifelong. So when you're thinking, just as you said, Fran, about resources, that they don't necessarily want that person attached to them, they're looking at resources, whether it be ICT based, whether it be learning and teaching approaches that they know themselves as a learner, and that's where it's really important to build up that profile of what is it they actually need and what can we support them to build that scaffolding round about themselves that they can access moving forward, and also be looking at on an ongoing basis, because although that condition, thinking of dyslexia as being that lifelong condition, their needs will change as the demands of the curriculum change and the demands of what is round about them, whether it be the curriculum in school or when they go into that world of work, that they then know what they can tap into and what's going to support them and scaffold them moving forward.
We do often have, I'm just thinking of some of the youngsters that I've got that have moved from National 5 into higher this year, and although they didn't require assessment arrangements or didn't or felt they didn't need assessment arrangements for the National 5 in English, when they come to do their higher or drama particularly sticks in my head, there's a lot of writing and drama, they then come to me, or the teachers often come to me and say, he's not getting through it, he's not getting it finished. If I give him this extra time, this is what he can achieve. And quite often we will adapt the assessment arrangements to suit the subject, and also to suit the level, or put them in as the level of the demand really increases. The same, we've actually got quite a lot of youngsters that's big longer exams that we've had them to put breaks in for them. I can't remember what the subject is, but some of them are 2.5 hour long exams, especially for the advanced hires. And pupils, they just need a brain break, so we're having to put that in for some pupils as well. So definitely things change as they go through school.
Thank you. Just moving on now to a question that we were asked recently. Somebody within a local authority said that there seems to be a lack of teacher awareness about dyslexia and training among the teachers in our area. And I wonder, you know, Fran, could you maybe talk about what support is available for teachers, and then maybe Debbie and Dawn talk about, as current practitioners, how you find the resources that are there to be used?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we did have a national programme which called the Making Sense programme, and it focused very much on dyslexia and inclusive practice. And Dyslexia Scotland were, you know, an incredibly important partner in that programme with the Scottish Government and Education Scotland. And through that programme, we built on what was already there, you know, what supports were already there. We refreshed the Addressing Dyslexia toolkit to make it more accessible for staff. We did change the focus of the toolkit. It is now really focused on educational practitioners. It doesn't have a section, for example, for families, but that's what the Dyslexia Scotland's website, you know, will fulfill that, and also for children and young people. So we have that free resource. There is an expectation from Education Scotland, from scrutiny colleagues, inspection, that resource is used in every school. It may well come up in, you know, through when inspections are happening. We also, through the programme, developed 3 incremental modules targeted at, again, educational practitioners. And what's really important about those is that the fact that they're free, but they're set in the Scottish context, because we didn't have anything like that before. And they've proven to be extremely positive, extremely, you know, successful in many ways. And they've already been refreshed. We worked hard to refresh them last year and get them published. There are a range of professional learning opportunities. You know, I've spent the whole of today with one local authority. I regularly link with teams of pupil support teachers, support for learning teachers who are wanting to explore dyslexia. I think it's important as well to recognise that, like many industries, you know, there is often a churn of staff. So you'll always have new staff coming in. So it's never a job done. You'll always have to make sure that for example, your probationer programs that run for newly qualified teachers coming out of teacher training courses, that there is information on this, on inclusion, you know, and looking at, you know, dyslexia amongst other areas, that to make sure that linking with local authorities, that if they're asking for support for their central CPD program, that there is, if they don't have that specialist knowledge within that local authority, they can access it nationally. Many local authorities absolutely do have that specialist knowledge. You know, Dawn and Debbie are really, you know, fantastic examples of practitioners with that expertise. So it's a range of information, and really important that we support and promote that professional dialogue, that support and challenge with our colleagues. And that's certainly a theme running through all of the modules. And we always recommend, you know, people to look at the toolkit, to look at Dyslexia Scotland's own website. There's some fantastic leaflets on there. And also at the moment, you know, Dyslexia and RAP for children and young people.
I think Fran summed it up really well when she said, you know, there's always a changeover of staff, so it's never a job done, and it's about keeping that awareness live and having that in a multifaceted layer. So thinking about when you're having that direct dialogue with colleagues and saying, do you know about this? Have you checked out the toolkit? Have you, and directing them to it for specific things that then alludes to them looking further into it. I've also seen really good practice where staff groups have taken the toolkit and they've perhaps done a case study, or they've gone through it and they've looked at it just to raise awareness of everything that's actually on there. The other thing that is really well done is with Dyslexia Scotland having that Dyslexia Awareness Week, and every year having the access to different presentations just to keep that awareness alive, and for schools to tap into that, and it focuses on different themes every year so that it just keeps that drip awareness, so that you're constantly refreshing that. Go back and look at these things. With Dyslexia Scotland, with Addressing Dyslexia Toolkit, they're updated regularly. We regularly look at them, keep advice fresh, change things to replicate what's happening nationally. So it's good to have that refresh going in so that people can go in and see what's new. Equally with the modules, I know within our authority, we have quite often seen that we've used that going out to probationers and asking probationers to undertake the level 1 as a whole cohort. The same with on in-service days, perhaps asking support staff to look at that, and having that universal, it's set up to be for educational practitioners across the board, and having that knowledge and skill base being built across the authority. And I think, Dawn, you've done that within your authority as well.
I just think when Fran said that, because I had all my PSAs, because they're on the ground supporting these youngsters in classes often, or teachers will ask them for advice and things. I had all the PSAs, did the module 1, but we've just had a turnover of staff. I think I've got 3 or 4 new ones that haven't done it yet, so that's a wee reminder for me, Fran. And all my support for learning teachers have done level 2 and are working on level 3. I do the same with the probationers. I get a chance to speak to them during one of their meeting times, their mentor times, and I talk about not just dyslexia but all different needs of youngsters. But Dyslexia Scotland is the modules is what I direct them towards as well, just to give them an understanding. I mean, I'm aware that there is an assessment during their teacher training now that refers to dyslexia or additional support needs, because I've helped some students through that as well. But they very much feel when they're in the classroom they need to learn a little bit more. And as I say often to these young people, it's to young teachers, it's the young people in front of you that are the best teachers, because what works for one won't work for the next, but it might work for the next one. And I've got some very good PSAs that kind of take some youngsters under their wing and purposely go out to find things that will suit those young people. We've got a young lad with quite severe dyslexia, and the PSA that he was like, oh, this happened, and Dawn, what can I direct him to Call Scotland, and he's come out with a whole programme of different ICT resources that help this particular young person with his particular difficulties. But I mean, we all would like to be able to do more to support young people all the time, but it's about managing the resources that we've got, and like Fran said, a lot of them are universal and will help support lots of pupils, not just your dyslexic learners.